Someone has $40,000 sitting in a savings account earning almost nothing. They also have a car loan at 3% interest and a mortgage at 4%. Following the popular advice to get out of debt as fast as possible, they consider draining that entire savings account to pay off both loans immediately. On paper, this feels responsible, even virtuous. But run the actual numbers, and in a lot of cases, this move quietly makes that person poorer, not richer, over the following decade. Debt itself was never the problem. The problem is that most popular financial advice treats all debt as functionally identical, when in reality, some debt is a genuine tool for building wealth, and treating it the same way as the debt that's actually dangerous can cost people real money for years. It's a strange thing to sit with, that the very same behavior, aggressively eliminating a loan, can be either a smart financial move or a costly one, entirely depending on a number most people never actually stop to compare it against. Financial advice content overwhelmingly frames debt as a single, uniform enemy, something to eliminate as aggressively and completely as possible, regardless of the interest rate attached to it or what else that money could otherwise be doing. This framing makes intuitive sense for a specific, dangerous category of debt: high-interest credit card balances, payday loans, anything compounding faster than almost any investment could realistically outpace. But according to research published by personal finance academics and the CFA Institute on the concept of good debt versus bad debt, the interest rate on a loan relative to realistic investment returns available at the same time is the single most important variable determining whether carrying that debt actually makes financial sense, a distinction that gets flattened almost completely in most mainstream debt payoff advice. This matters because the two categories of debt often get lumped together using the exact same vocabulary. Debt is debt, even though a 22% credit card balance and a 4% mortgage behave like almost entirely different financial instruments once you actually compare them against realistic alternative uses of the same dollar. Let's start with the basic mechanics of why interest rate comparisons matter so much, because the math here is more straightforward than the emotional discomfort around debt makes it feel. If someone has a loan charging 3% interest annually, and that same person has access to an investment reasonably expected to return 7% annually over the long term, on average, every dollar they use to pay down that loan early instead of investing, it is a dollar that gives up the difference between those two rates. The technical process looks like this. Paying off debt early is mathematically equivalent to making a guaranteed investment that returns exactly the interest rate on that loan, no more, no less. If the loan costs 3%, paying it off early is functionally the same decision as choosing a guaranteed 3% return over a historically likely 7% return available elsewhere. Framed this way, pay off the low-interest loan as fast as possible and choose the lower-return investment on purpose are the exact same action, just described using two very different emotional vocabularies. This is where an invisible psychological mechanism takes over, one that behavioral finance researchers refer to as debt aversion, a documented tendency for people to weigh the discomfort of owing money more heavily than a rational calculation of interest rates and opportunity costs would suggest. Debt aversion isn't irrational in a vacuum. Owing money does carry real risk, and the psychological relief of being debt-free has genuine, measurable value to many people's day-to-day well-being. But the invisible part is that this emotional discomfort applies almost identically whether the debt in question charges 22% interest on a credit card or 3% interest on a mortgage, even though the actual financial risk and cost of these two debts are dramatically different. The brain's alarm system for "I owe someone money" doesn't have a built-in interest rate calculator attached to it, which means low interest, genuinely useful debt often gets treated with the same urgency as debt that's actively working against someone's financial future. There's a related invisible mechanism tied to inflation specifically, one that rarely gets mentioned in typical debt payoff conversations. A fixed-rate loan, like most mortgages, gets effectively cheaper over time in real terms as inflation rises, because the borrower keeps repaying the exact same nominal monthly payment while their income, in a growing economy, tends to rise alongside inflation. A mortgage payment that felt significant in year 1 can feel comparatively minor by year 20, not because the loan changed, but because inflation quietly eroded the real value of that fixed payment obligation the entire time. This means holding certain fixed-rate debt during inflationary periods isn't just neutral, it can be actively advantageous, since the lender is effectively receiving payments that are worth less in real purchasing power with every passing year, a dynamic that works in the borrower's favor specifically because they didn't rush to pay it off early. Two real-world patterns make this concrete. Financial planning research has consistently shown that homeowners who invested extra cash in diversified market index funds rather than making additional principal payments on mortgages below roughly 5% interest have historically come out significantly ahead over 10 and 20-year periods, based on average historical stock market returns compared to typical mortgage rates during the same windows. A second pattern shows up in how businesses themselves use debt, which is instructive precisely because businesses tend to separate emotion from the math more consistently than individuals do. Companies routinely take on low-interest debt specifically to fund expansion, equipment, or acquisitions when the expected return on that investment clearly exceeds the cost of borrowing, a strategy called leverage, and this is treated as sound, even sophisticated financial management in a corporate context. The exact same mathematical logic that gets labeled irresponsible when an individual applies it to their own mortgage or student loan. A company that paid off every low-interest loan immediately, refusing to carry any debt regardless of the return available on the capital it freed up, would likely be criticized by its own shareholders for leaving predictable growth on the table. The opposite reaction an individual usually receives for doing the same thing with a mortgage. This challenges the common assumption that being debt-free is an unambiguous financial goal that should be pursued as aggressively as possible regardless of the specific numbers involved. In reality, the right amount of debt to carry is a math problem with an actual correct answer for any given interest rate and set of alternative uses for that same money, not a moral question with debt-free always representing the most virtuous outcome. The friction point isn't that debt aversion is foolish. The psychological comfort of being debt-free is a completely legitimate factored away. It's that popular advice rarely presents it as a trade-off being made, a choice to prioritize emotional comfort over statistically likely additional wealth, and instead presents debt elimination as an obviously correct move with no real cost attached to it at all. Zoom out, and this tension between emotionally satisfying certainty and mathematically superior probability shows up constantly in other financial decisions too. People frequently choose to pay off small, low-balance debts first under the debt snowball method specifically because the emotional win of eliminating an account entirely provides motivation. Even when mathematically prioritizing the highest interest debt first would save more money overall, a trade-off personal finance experts increasingly acknowledge explicitly, since sustained motivation genuinely matters for follow-through. Insurance decisions follow a similar pattern, where people often prefer paying a guaranteed premium over accepting a small probability of a much larger loss, even when the raw math slightly favors going without coverage, because certainty itself carries real psychological value beyond its pure financial calculation. Retirement savings decisions show a related pattern too, where people frequently choose a smaller, guaranteed employer match structure over a slightly better but less certain alternative, prioritizing predictability over a marginally higher expected outcome, which isn't irrational so much as it is a completely different, equally valid set of priorities being applied without anyone ever naming the trade-off out loud. So the next time debt payoff advice presents debt-free as an automatic universal win, it's worth remembering what that framing leaves out. Not all debt behaves the same way, and the interest rate attached to a loan, compared honestly against what that same money could otherwise be earning, determines whether paying it off early is a smart financial move or a costly emotional one dressed up as responsibility. Being debt-free can absolutely be the right choice for a specific person's specific numbers and specific peace of mind. It just isn't automatically the right choice simply because it's debt.